Hello, welcome everyone to this Jeju Forum 2021 panel on assessing emerging technology developments and the impact on nuclear weapon risks, organized for the Jeju Forum by the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, the APLN. My name is Shatabisha Shetty. I am the director of the APLN, and it's my great pleasure to be joined on this panel today by three fantastic speakers. I will introduce them now in the order in which they'll be making their opening remarks. First, we have Dr. Namrata Goswami joining us from Alabama in the US. Dr. Goswami is an independent scholar on space policy, great power politics, and ethnic conflicts. Her most recent book, published last year, focuses on China, the US, and India, and explores the economic ambitions of the second space race. In today's session, she'll be offering her analysis on national space programs and missile developments across the Asia Pacific. Second, we have Dr. Manpreet Sethi joining us from New Delhi in India. Dr. Sethi is a distinguished fellow and head of the Nuclear Security Project at the Center for Air Power Studies in New Delhi and is a member of the APLN Board of Directors. Dr. Sethi is an esteemed nuclear expert, having contributed extensively to numerous publications on nuclear strategy, non-proliferation, deterrence, nuclear security issues, and more. In her presentation today, she will provide an assessment on technological developments in India and how they affect nuclear decision-making and risk reduction. Third, we have Dr. Tong Zhao joining us from Beijing. Dr. Zhao is a senior fellow at Carnegie's Nuclear Policy Program based at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. He's also a member of the APLN Board of Directors. Dr. Zhao has researched and written extensively on strategic security issues, including nuclear weapons policy, arms control, hypersonic weapons, and China's security and foreign policy. Dr. Zhao will be bringing to this discussion his thoughts and assessments on China's new technology developments, the impact on strategic stability, and the interaction between new systems and nuclear weapons. And last, but certainly not least, we're delighted to welcome Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, who joins us from New York. Ms. Nakamitsu is currently the Undersecretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs at the United Nations, a role she has held since 2017. She has many years of distinguished experience under her belt within and without the UN. High Representative Nakamitsu has also taught as a professor of international relations at Hitotsubushi University in Tokyo, where she was a member of the Foreign Exchange Council to Japan's foreign minister, among other esteemed roles. Today, she will discuss the UN disarmament agenda, assessment of risks, and recommendations for managing new technologies. We are truly delighted to have convened an exceptionally qualified group to assess advances in emerging technologies, with a special focus on the Asia-Pacific region. Are these advances exacerbating tensions between states and increasing the risk of nuclear weapons use, or do they offer the opportunity for innovation and solutions to managing nuclear risks more effectively? Our job in this panel is to attempt to answer these questions by evaluating the extent of the challenge and determining what can be done to address it. And without further ado, I will hand the floor over to our first presenter, Dr. Namrata Goswami. Namrata.
Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be here today with the rest of my panel and you. So what I'm going to do today is, in the 8 minutes that I have, talk a bit about the national space programs and missile developments in the Asia Pacific. So why the Asia Pacific, and why are we focusing on it? There are two reasons. One, the Asia Pacific is host to major countries, to include the United States, which has base presence here, China, a major spacefaring nation with nuclear weapons, India, with a very similar category, Japan, which is also spacefaring, and other nations. The second reason we focus on the Asia Pacific is, of course, because it's slotted to become one of the major economic powerhouses, to include in its space focus and missile development programs. PricewaterhouseCoopers predicts that China would become the largest economy by 2050, followed by India, and then the US. So you can see that there is this emergence in terms of economic prospects. Now, it is in this context that the national space programs and their connected missile development programs become strategically important. As I mentioned before, the two major spacefaring nations are nuclear-equipped nations. So how this impacts in terms of space situational awareness is that it's directly connected to nuclear command control communications. It's also connected to missile tracking, missile development, jamming capacities, ASAT weapon. A scenario that I can think of in terms of the Asia Pacific is, for example, if you have a conflict over Taiwan, what could play out in that particular conflict is that China could use its ASAT weapons to take out some of the space situational awareness weapons for the United States in case it decides to intervene. It could jam signals to the nuclear command and control, or it could jam signals for missile tracking and development. A second scenario I can think of in terms of the Asia Pacific is North Korea engaging in a high altitude nuclear detonation. What that could lead to is, again, taking out of satellites in LEO, possibly, and that could result in South Korea and Japan not knowing what North Korea is really up to in terms of strategic weapon signaling. And that can lead to uncertainty and escalation. So it's in the context of this scenario that the development of space programs in China, India, Iran, Pakistan, North Korea becomes critical. For example, China in 2020 established an independent navigation system, the Beidou navigation system. Now, what this did for China is that it offered China independent military command and control. It offered it a capability to track its own missiles, and also in terms of offsetting the fear that if it depended on the US GPS, Global Positioning System, it's vulnerable because there is the concern that the US could have cut off GPS during the Taiwan Strait crisis in 1996. Now, in terms of strategic communication, which is the focus of our presentation today, what an ASAT capacity does for China, because it has improved that capacity in the last few years, is that it offers it a possibility of creating vulnerability in the other country that is present in Asia Pacific, which is the US. And because the US depends on military command and control, navigation, and absolutely everything that it does in terms of civilian infrastructure on space assets. Now, one of the concerns in terms of China's nuclear weapons development is that about 75 of those missiles, including nuclear and conventional, are equipped with hypersonics, especially the DF-17. Now, the ASAT weapon to watch in terms of China's capability is, of course, the SC-19, which has also been improved over the years with a robotic arm. For example, the SY-17, which was launched in 2016, has an arm. Now, in terms of strategic signaling, which is possible for another country as well, SY satellite of that order can be used both for debris removal, but also can be used in terms of grabbing another satellite. So these are the kind of developments that we grapple with in terms of China. India is also changing in terms of its strategic posture in space. So in 2008, as a response to China's ASAT test, India established a separate integrated space cell within the Integrated Defense Services headquarters. Now, the important development in terms of space weaponization, if I may, or militarization is a better word, is that India also tested an ASAT weapon, Mission Shakti, in 2019. Now, it also basically argued right after the test that India has become a comprehensive space power today. Historically, India's space program has been very careful not to have militarization of space as a goal, but since 2014, after the coming of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, there is this assertion of India's power projection, and space plays a very critical part. As we know, India has also demonstrated a hypersonic technology demonstrator vehicle with a Mach 6, which is 2 kilometers per second. And this was launched on the Agni missile, solid propellant rocket motor. So why am I bringing those connections? Because the one thing that you realize in reading or looking at missile development and space programs is that there is an inherent integral connection between those two capabilities. Now, since 2008, the other country that has recognized the importance of space in terms of military capability is Japan. Historically, like India, Japan has been careful not to militarize its space programs. But with the changes in the Asia Pacific, including the growing conventional nuclear and space military capacity of China, Japan is also focusing on a robust space situational awareness in collaboration with the US, Australia, and has also, what is critical, since 2018, under the direction of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, has highlighted on improving Japan's military space capacity. Now, in April 2020, the Japanese Diet, which is Japan's parliament, passed a bill that established the Space Domain Mission Unit within the Japanese Air Force, which is their space service concentrated on defense. Japan is also developing a ground-based deep space radar that can monitor satellites in geostationary orbit. And this is the important part. They're also developing a satellite interceptor, primarily to counter satellite threats from China. The scenario that Japan is working towards is in case there is conflict escalation in the East China Sea Islands, which is disputed between Japan and China. North Korea is another country to watch because, of course, North Korea has not demonstrated any anti-satellite capability, but what is critical from space situational awareness is that it's developing jamming capacities within a particular geographic area. And in 2017, North Korea tested its first intercontinental ballistic missile, the Hwasong-14, which has a range of about 13,000 kilometers. And again, as I said before, what you can realize from the North Korean program is that the ICBMs were developed by its space launch program, the UNHA, and which is estimated to be a 3-stage North Korean rocket. And North Korea has already launched satellites into orbit in 2012 and 2016. In 2020, another country that showcased its military space capacity with launch of its military satellite Noor is the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps of Iran. So they launched this satellite successfully into low Earth orbit on its rocket Qassed Messenger, which is a Persian term. And it was actually not launched from Tehran, but was launched from a secretive guard base near Shahrud, Iran. And so you can see that for North Korea, investment in its ballistic missile program is connected to the development of its space program as well. Finally, before I talk about a bit about the implications, another country to watch is, of course, Pakistan. Now, Pakistan is, of course, a nuclear weapon state with advanced missile capacity. The strategic context in which I can see Pakistan developing a space situational awareness and military space capacity is its rivalry with India. And the trajectory that I can see, which the panel can discuss, is that if you look at how Pakistan's nuclear weapons program has developed, there has been cooperation with China. And so I can see a very similar trajectory as part of the Belt and Road Initiative Space Information Corridor, that Pakistan, because of its rivalry or adverse relation with India, might invest in military space capacity. Finally, let me talk about the implications for risk mitigation concerning nuclear decision-making. As I mentioned before, we can think about a Taiwan Strait scenario where loss of GPS communication can lead to presumption that there is an escalation in a conflict if the US loses its eye for NC3 and suspects that China's ASAT or co-orbital capacity is behind it. And the biggest strategic concern that I hear in the US today is that that could actually lead to a global conflict. Now, how can you mitigate this kind of risk? A lesson from the Cold War, especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, is that both countries, the US and the USSR, established hotlines, communications capability that actually resulted in transparency. You can see a very similar kind of institutional setting develop in the Asia Pacific, given what I have pointed out in terms of escalation of missile technology and its connected space situational awareness and military space capacity. I think I'll end there, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Namrata, for that very detailed presentation on the development of national space programs in countries across the Asia Pacific. It really offers us an insight into the threat perceptions and the kind of demonstrable power projection that we're seeing, and the role of CSBMs and other measures that could potentially be used to mitigate these growing risks, something that we could pick up possibly later in the Q&A. I'll now turn to our second speaker, Dr. Manpreet Sethi.
Thank you very much, Chata. Hello to everyone. It's such a pleasure and a privilege to be part of the Jeju Forum. Once again, though I feel cheated that I've been deprived of another opportunity of actually visiting the beautiful and inspiring place. But it's so wonderful to be on the panel with such great panelists. I'm also glad that this session is devoted to emerging technologies and their impact on nuclear deterrence, because over the last 2 decades, we have seen several strategic technologies emerging with no kinds of limitations. And as they're maturing and they are being deployed, they are going to intersect with principles of nuclear deterrence in ways that we don't fully understand at this moment, because these are still, actions which are in the process of happening. So I want to discuss 4 such technologies: ballistic missile defense, hypersonic delivery systems, cyber offensives, and autonomous weapon systems. Namrata has given us a fantastic sweep of the country positions on particularly missile and space. But I want to look at these 4 technologies and how um, I believe they seem to be impacting nuclear deterrence. What kind of new nuclear risks might be created as they become operational? And lastly, I will briefly give a perspective on how India is looking at these developments, what it is doing, and from the point of view of its own nuclear deterrence, because it does have a very different approach to nuclear weapons. So let me first talk about ballistic missile defense. Not exactly a new technology, but it is intersecting with nuclear deterrence in new ways. Now, during the bipolar Cold War period, the idea of nuclear deterrence, as we all know, was premised on mutual vulnerability. And this was codified in the Anti Ballistic Missile Treaty that prohibited deployment of BMD except at one site for both the US and the USSR. But in early 2000s, the US decided to go ahead with its BMD program to meet threats from countries that it felt could not be deterred by nuclear retaliation. So they had to be defended against. And while the US justified it for limited circumstances against a certain set of states which had only a handful of nuclear missiles, Russia and China saw a more sinister move to degrade their own nuclear deterrence. Fearful of a BMD capability that former President Trump said would be able to intercept any missile launched against the US anywhere, anytime, any place. So when a statement like that comes out, Russia and China have obviously focused on their strategic modernization, including increasing numbers, building countermeasures, and resorting to strategies of ambiguity, mixing offensive and defensive systems to enhance deterrence. And this raises risks. It raises risks of inadvertent escalation. So BMD, while essentially being itself a defensive technology, has led to new kinds of risks being created. The second emerging technology to consider is hypersonic delivery systems. Now, it is in fact one of the technologies being seen as a solution or stability restoring to BMD by Russia and China. Hypersonic missiles have special attributes of speed and maneuverability, making interception difficult, and thus they are able to defeat ballistic missile defense. However, these missiles bring in 2 kinds of ambiguities of the warhead that they could carry. In the case of Russia, it has said that it would be a nuclear delivery vehicle, whereas in the case of China, it's still not clear whether it would be conventional or nuclear. So this ambiguity, along with an ambiguity on the target, because of the high maneuverability of this missile, one cannot be sure as to where it's going to target. That creates, problems. The tendency, especially in amongst countries which have low trust levels, and they would be in a crisis as a result, the tendency would be to assume the worst. So you would assume that it's a nuclear armed missile coming at you, and it's headed towards degrading your nuclear capability, even if it's a conventionally armed hypersonic missile. Now, for an adversary that faces a country with a missile defense, but which itself has a small nuclear arsenal, the fear would be that even conventionally armed hypersonic missiles could destroy a portion of their nuclear assets, which would mean degrading their retaliatory capability and thus interfering with deterrence. So the tendency in this country, which is facing a country with BMD and with hypersonic missiles, could be to lower their hair trigger, their readiness postures to more hair trigger levels, move on to launch on warning or launch under attack kind of positions. Now, in doing so, the country would ostensibly be enhancing its deterrence, but it would also be raising the risks of inadvertence, misperception, miscalculations in crisis. So therefore, stumbling into a nuclear war becomes that much more possible. Hypersonic induction also leads to an offense-defense spiral, causing arms race instability. The US, for instance, is now strengthening its BMD to defeat incoming hypersonic missiles. And it's also working on countermeasures. So there is a hypersonic missile defense, which is being talked about. And some of these countermeasures would involve placing sensors and interceptors in the outer space. So we see the possibility of arms race moving into outer space once we get into the hypersonic field. The third troublesome technology is offensive use of cyber attacks. Modern warfighting depends so much on rapid collection, processing, and transmission of data. And if there is a data disruption, which would be a natural tendency in order to blunt or blind the warfighting capability of the other side, this disruption of military capability, particularly if it moves on to nuclear command and control and communications, including, as Namrata pointed out, interfering with early warning systems or satellites, national command authority or delivery systems, it creates a whole new plethora of risks. So jamming or hijacking of systems, hacking of systems to affect nuclear retaliation, or injecting the system with false information, or in the case of non-state actors, injecting counterfeit launch orders in order to bring two nuclear weapon states to nuclear blows could trigger unintentional escalation. The very fear that such compromise could compel nations to adopt risky nuclear postures. So it's not just, it's just the very fear that this could happen could make nations move towards risky nuclear postures. And you would move again to the risk of inadvertent escalation. The last technology I want to mention is artificial intelligence. Now, lethal autonomous weapon systems that can deliver nuclear weapons from across platforms bring in a set of complexities. And we've begun to hear about the nuclear armed countries wanting to move into this domain. A nation fearing an adversary's AI advantage, his artificial intelligence advantage, could feel cornered or on the edge. And the threat of disarming first strikes with even conventional precision strikes, which is the biggest sort of fear amongst countries these days, that you would be hit not by nuclear weapons, but by conventionally armed delivery systems hitting out at your nuclear systems. So this, when it is enhanced by artificial intelligence, also when it is done by a country which also has artificial intelligence enhanced BMD systems, would end up severely undercutting nuclear deterrence. I started by saying mutual vulnerability is what kept peace or nuclear deterrence in place. But all of these new systems are taking away that sense of mutual vulnerability and contributing to the idea that one can protect itself and undertake a first strike, and the other side would not be able to undertake retaliation. So this goes to the bottom of nuclear deterrence and creates a problem there. So in the case of each technology, the risk of inadvertence, I think, is growing. A few words now on how India is looking at these technologies and what is it working on. India's nuclear doctrine has sensibly ascribed a narrow deterrent role to its nuclear weapons. It's not meant to deter a range of contingencies. It's essentially for nuclear deterrence. And this deterrence is premised on the idea of retaliation to cause punishment. And hence, the credibility of India's nuclear deterrence relies heavily on the confidence in its survivability of the nuclear arsenal and nuclear command and control. In this context, India has opted to develop, though it has not yet deployed, BMD for a limited purpose of protection of retaliatory assets. So survivability is where the focus is. Some R&D on hypersonics, as mentioned by Namrata, has been seen. Some testing has happened in the last few years. But the military utility of this technology will only grow if China deploys an effective missile defense, because then you would need hypersonics in order to penetrate the missile defense. So India's progress on this technology will depend, I think, to a large extent on what happens in China. On the protection of its nuclear command and control from cyber offensives, India has opted to keep the systems as air-gapped as possible, and it is also reticent on the use of artificial intelligence in nuclear systems and would rather have a man in the loop for decision-making. And I don't see nuclear command and control of India being substantially penetrated by artificial intelligence in the coming years. I want to end by emphasizing that the approach of India to nuclear weapons is quite different from others. Perhaps it's the closest to China's traditional approach, which might be changing. India considers nuclear weapons as weapons of mass destruction and very different from conventional weapons. Their role is best suited for deterrence by punishment, which is easy to cause because of the inherent nature of the weapon. So India has not felt, therefore, the need to mirror the capability buildup of the adversary or participate in any offensive or defensive arms race. While new technological developments will have to be factored in to ensure the robustness, effectiveness, and survivability of its nuclear deterrence, major changes in the arsenal may not necessarily be warranted. However, given the lack of shared understanding of risks and absence of dialogue, China's technological developments, ostensibly being done to cater for its threat perception from USA, does have a downstream effect on India and thereon to Pakistan. Perception gaps on these technologies can exacerbate nuclear risks, and therefore they need to be addressed. How this can be done can be part of our discussion that can follow after everyone has had their say. But thank you so much, Shata, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Manpreet, for that excellent explanation of how the differing new technologies can potentially undermine deterrence and increase or decrease mutual vulnerability. It's a fascinating discussion and thinking through how these technologies can incentivize offensive first steps and increase their motivation to carry out disarming first strikes. So hopefully we can kind of go into it in further depth in the Q&A. I will now turn to our third speaker, Dr. Tong Zhao.
Thank you, Shada. It's also my great pleasure to be part of this discussion. In the Chinese case, China has invested heavily into many of these new technologies. It has made impressive progress in developing and deploying hypersonic weapons. It deploys one of the world's first road mobile medium-range boost glider missile, DF-17. China's hypersonic missiles could be used not only for delivering conventional warheads, but maybe also for nuclear warheads in the future. And if so, because of the maneuverability of such missiles, once they are launched, they would create ambiguity about what are the targets, what are the intended targets. And that ambiguity could then create misunderstandings in the minds of its enemies. China is also investing a lot into missile defense technologies, developing various types of missile defense systems. If China decides to massively deploy missile defense technologies, especially in a layered manner, it may not affect strategic stability with other major nuclear powers, but could create concerns in the case of India, for example. And relatedly, China also has an anti-satellite technology that has been widely discussed by international analysts. The primary objective of China's ASAT is to counter American missile defense and outer space superiority. But it could also cause concerns and be targeted in a preemptive strike by Chinese enemies and therefore lead to escalations in a conventional war. China has developed increasingly advanced outer space technologies, including early warning systems. And with the help of early warning technology, China may shift towards launch under attack or launch on warning postures, even though there is still a lot of uncertainty about how much China is doing in this area. China's AI technology may not be contributing to China's nuclear command control or decision-making process, but reportedly China is already using AI to help detect enemy vessels on China's submarines and maybe nuclear submarines as well. China is developing advanced quantum computing and quantum communication technologies, and also investing into autonomous weapon technologies, drones, and swarm technologies. But the impact of these technologies is not known yet and is not widely discussed in China. Officially, at the government level, China recognizes the importance of understanding the impact of emerging technologies and to work with other countries to jointly address the potential risks from emerging technologies. China recognized that emerging technologies could potentially undermine strategic stability among nuclear rivals. It has called on all nuclear weapon states to discuss the impact of emerging technologies at international forum like the P5 process. And I think this is an opportunity for international multilateral dialogues and cooperation to examine and address the potential risk created by new technologies. But also there are obstacles for China to participate in international efforts to impose real and strict limitations on the development of destabilizing new technologies. Firstly, because of the rising strategic competition between China and the United States, countries tend to care more about the relative gains in this competition. And in the Chinese case, China appears confident in its own capability to exploit the military potential of new technologies. And therefore, that may undermine Chinese incentive to join other countries, especially its rivals, in imposing real and strict limitations and restrictions on the development of new technologies. And secondly, it appears that among Chinese strategic security policy experts, there is a lack of understanding about the practical risks created by various new technologies. One example that is widely discussed by international analysts is China's dual-use missiles, such as DF-26, that can carry either a nuclear warhead or conventional warhead, and can switch between a conventional and a nuclear warhead on the battlefield. And it is widely believed by international analysts that such dual-use missiles could cause misunderstanding and therefore risks of inadvertent escalation in a crisis. But there is no evidence that such risk is widely discussed or recognized by most Chinese experts. And China is still massively producing and deploying these dual-use missiles. And another thing is because many Chinese experts believe that the US is becoming increasingly hostile against China, and therefore, even though new technologies create some risk of incidents or inadvertent escalation, apparently, to many Chinese experts, the risks are not high enough to deter and discourage perceived American aggression against China. So it looks like some of the mainstream thinking in China is maybe we need to allow the new technologies to create even greater risks, the risks that would be sufficient to dissuade the United States from conducting aggressions against China before China can join the US and other countries in really addressing these risks and taking measures to manage these risks. So there is a lack of interest, at least in the near term, to take immediate measures on risk reduction because of perceived strategic hostility from the United States. And lastly, I think many Chinese experts, they simply don't believe that other countries, especially the United States, are very serious in their own cases to address the impact of new technologies. They don't believe that the United States and other countries are taking serious measures themselves to examine and manage the risks created by new technologies. And they also very much suspect that the US and other countries are simply using the excuse of new technologies and the risks created by new technologies to prevent China from developing legitimate national defense capabilities. So I think certainly there is a need to have more discussions and maybe dialogues to mitigate these misunderstandings before we can have a serious discussion on this issue. I think I will stop here and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tong. That was an excellent description of China's technological developments and the challenge of tackling the issue of the lack of understanding of risks. But as you say, this offers the opportunity for international dialogues on addressing these issues. And last but not least, I will hand the floor over to High Representative Izumi Nakamitsu.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And I'm really deeply impressed by all of the presentations that we just heard. Thank you for giving me also an opportunity to comment. I'm going to obviously discuss some of those issues from a global point of view, where I sit at the United Nations. And let me start with the analysis of the current situations. And what is very important to see, obviously, is that the military applications of emerging technologies and nuclear weapons cannot be separated from the prevailing geostrategic context. And I think it's a very simple characterization, but the current international nuclear weapons climate is characterized by, for example, antagonistic relationships between all nuclear armed states. Also, the countries are giving greater role for nuclear weapons in their strategic military doctrines. We see also historic level of military spending on the one hand, and on the other hand, eroding arms control and disarmament frameworks. And increasingly sophisticated weapon systems are raising the risk of also conventional conflict between nuclear armed states. Some of you have already mentioned those. Now, the technological developments and existence now of new domains that are cyberspace and outer space, when combined with nuclear weapons, have really added potential new vulnerabilities and exacerbated risk-generating behavior. And I think there is a growing recognition, certainly, about the risks at this nexus, but concerted action is still very much limited, primarily due to probably two factors. The first one is the absence of shared understandings about the risk, and second, the often siloed nature of the way emerging risks are being discussed. Now, there are obviously discussions taking place, and I will touch on some of them, but those different discussions are not linked up together as of now. Now, so what are we particularly concerned about or worried about with these situations? The increasing use of emerging technologies can carry out hostile or malicious acts that fall below what many states will probably regard as the threshold for the use of force. These technologies can include drones and information and communication technologies, ICTs, high-powered lasers and so-called less lethal weapons, and the use of space technologies, as has been already quite elaborated on this panel. And such uses actually can have grave implications for human rights and also humanitarian concerns when or if they target critical infrastructure necessary for the safety and security of civilians, or when they result in the loss of life. And there is also risk of unintended escalation based on misperception and miscalculation. And we have actually seen some of those near misses during the previous Cold War. So with the technologies, I think the risk definitely is there, and we are very much worried about that. So clearly, we think that the development and implication of norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors in various fields, including in the use of digital technologies and also in outer space, can be part of an effective response to those challenges. But what are we doing about these concerns? I will come back to some of the more specifics, but let me start with, if you will, broader actions related to encouraging responsible innovation, because I think it's really important, especially going into the future. Now, the Secretary General, Guterres, committed in his disarmament agenda to engage and work with scientists, engineers, and industry to encourage responsible innovation of science and technology, and the importance of multi-stakeholder approaches. As you all know, the private sector is leading many of these technological developments, and these technologies really have a general use or dual use in those emerging fields. And so it is important to expose current and future innovators to disarmament and discuss responsible innovation and responsible use of these technologies. So just as an example, we are a United Nations Disarmament Office is engaged in responsible innovation work. And we have been doing that also in the Asia Pacific region as well, supported by the ASEAN Foundation, for example, and many universities and other regional stakeholders. And this work is essentially about introducing STEM students, science and technology, engineering, and mathematics students to disarmament through engagement with experts and works to build students' critical thinking and responsible innovation capacities. So now going back to more of a specific disarmament fields, let me mention a few that are doing the work as we speak. The first is artificial intelligence. Especially in the autonomous weapons, lethal autonomous weapons laws aspects. It has not yet been demonstrated that any algorithm can reliably make the human-like decisions and judgments required for a weapon system using autonomy in its critical functions to conform with international humanitarian law. So there are discussions taking place in the framework of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, is CCW for short, on lethal autonomous weapon systems. And we continue to support this very important work. This is really ongoing as we speak now. And I very much welcome the fact that despite the impacts of COVID-19, indeed, some progress was made in 2020 on advancing these discussions, and this resulted in convergences, if you will, between governments, including around the necessity of ensuring human control over the use of force. And I also welcome the new proposal by ICRC, which recommends new legally binding rules on rules to prohibit unpredictable autonomous weapon systems as indiscriminate, and prohibits the anti-personnel use of autonomous weapon systems, and regulate other uses of autonomous weapon systems to protect civilians and civilian objects. So these are just examples that discussions are taking place and they are making progress, and we definitely need to push forward. I will come back to the AI application on potentially nuclear weapons issues a little bit later. The second area where we are really intensifying work and indeed made some good progress is in cyberspace, cybersecurity issues. Now, 2021 has already been a good year for multilateral discussions at the UN on the use of ICTs. This March, the open-ended working group adopted a consensus report, and followed by closely by the successful adoption of an agreed report, consensus report, by the group of governmental experts, which just happened at the end of May. And the broad inclusive agreements in the OEWG report, together with the substantively in-depth, very rich GG report, constitute, we think, important steps forward. For example, the OEWG adopted a set of principles for capacity building in ICT sphere, which will help guide global assistance efforts going forward. And the GG made a key breakthrough, we think, in referencing international humanitarian law in the report, which had previously been a key issue of contention. So they are clearly making progress. And OEWG and the GG processes have both been key catalysts for the revitalization, if you will, of dialogue between major powers, and the successes of both have generated a positive atmosphere amongst all states discussing those issues, which hopefully can continue at the future discussions on this topic, including in the new OEWG on security of and in the use of information communication technologies, which has a 5-year mandate starting this year. We just had a very successful organizational session last week, and the substantive session will start in December this year. Now, the third area is outer space discussions. We had a very detailed presentations, very impressive one. But essentially, we are very much concerned, as you all pointed out, that outer space increasingly is developing into an arena for strategic military competition. Clearly, growing number of states have capabilities to attack space systems with a variety of means, both from space and also from the Earth. And when it comes to many counter space concepts, we certainly lack a common understanding of the impact and consequences of their use. So here again, a normative and legal framework governing outer space is not sufficiently developed to prevent these trends or protect against their undesirable consequences. So most states believe that elaboration of voluntary norms, rules, and principles can form the basis for future legally binding measures. As we all know, there has been a long-standing discussions on prevention of arms race in outer space. And now I think we need to bring those discussions related to voluntary norms of responsible behavior of states and combine those efforts and accelerate them. And those efforts are ongoing. Now, increased risk at nexus of emerging technology and the nuclear weapons, as some of you already pointed out, arise from different things. Destabilizing arms races based on perception that steps taken to strengthen one state's deterrent weakens the other state's deterrent. perceived weakened deterrence, prompting first strike use or use it or lose it mentalities. That's another factor potentially. Affected perceptions of usability, potentially lowering, I hope not, threshold for use. Ambiguities around targets and payloads due to the blurring lines between conventional and strategic weapons, another concern. Expanded nuclear doctrines that envisage potentially nuclear weapons use in a wider variety of scenarios, God forbid. And disruption or damage of nuclear command and control and communication systems, NC3 systems, leading to unintended and rapid escalation, or God forbid, kind of a scenario, obviously. Now, the challenge is the linkages between nuclear weapons and security of emerging domains and the blurring line between conventional strategic forces doesn't neatly fit into traditional frameworks for disarmament and arms control discussions. So what I really want to say as my conclusion is that there is a need for new thinking about how to address those risks and linkages between those issues. And my concluding suggestion, if you will, to avoid potential catastrophe, and as a start, I would like to suggest perhaps 4 things to states, to governments. The first is to develop shared understandings about the ramifications of a nexus between nuclear weapons and emerging technologies and potential new domains. The second is to ensure the same conversations about risks are taking place across relevant fora, such as, for example, NPT review cycle, and also, as I mentioned, a new OEWG on ICTs. The third is to promote confidence building measures, really, such as those related to crisis communication and prevention of dangerous military activities. As some of you mentioned, during the previous Cold War, there were efforts towards that end, communications channels, etc. Let's really think about that as a matter of urgency. And then finally, perhaps promote politically binding agreements among states, before being able to have legally binding measures. Start with the political arrangements, politically binding arrangements, agreements, including agreements, for example, not to interfere with nuclear command and control communications mechanisms. As I was listening panelists' presentations, those are real sort of a doomsday scenario, and we need to prevent them. We have to make efforts urgently. And those 4 things that I suggested, they are not, impossible things to do if we actually generate a sufficient level of political will. These are all doable, possible measures. So we would like to definitely encourage and work with and support efforts by those governments. And for that, we need to work with you guys. We would definitely need your support, your thinkings, both at the regional country-specific issues, but also broadly, how these issues can actually start at the regional level, that can also be elevated at the global level. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to some exchanges if we can still do that. Back to you, Shita.
Thank you, High Representative, for that excellent presentation. You offered a global perspective, a broad yet detailed assessment of the global trends, and some prescriptions on how to build a shared understanding of the risks. You made a number of important points, one of which is the role of responsible innovators in the private sector, which is a wonderful segue to our Q&A and discussion. So for this part of the session, we actually offered the opportunity for the public to pose questions to the panel. And we interestingly received a question from a representative of Raytheon Technologies. So this is a question that I will actually put to Namrata and Manpreet initially. So their question was, can AI-enabled situational awareness truly contribute to stability when the common perception of machines is that they are more easily corrupted from a data fidelity standpoint than humans, i.e. susceptible to hacks? So this is a question that I will put to Namrata first and then to Manpreet.
Thank you, Shada, and thank you again for these excellent presentations. I've learned a lot from each of you. Now, in terms of the question, it's a very interesting question because if you look at how artificial intelligence, especially if I'm thinking in terms of space situational awareness, where you have a AI-enabled satellite or capacity to look out for adversary satellites. Now, one of the interesting points is that, are they hackable, which is the question. If you look at how AIs are constituted, they are not as hackable as, for example, another capacity, for example, through cyber attacks on a satellite, because you will then have to target the training of the AI. Once trained, it becomes even more impossible because they're not based on coding as we see in general terms. So I would say that my response to the question is that in a future, if you have an AI-enabled, say, space situational awareness, communication capacity, I'm talking from the point of view of space, since that's my specialization. I'm sure Manpreet will have something different in terms of nuclear and autonomous weapons. But I would say that it is less hackable than a satellite, for example, which is not based on such capacity, because you have to then target the training lab. You might not know what's enabled in terms of an AI capacity. So there is that perspective that is out there in the AI community, at least in the US, that is not as susceptible as some of the systems we have today. Now, in comparison to humans, that's a completely different philosophical conversation, because humans can also get susceptible, but we still haven't had that conversation to that extent. Thank you.
Thank you. Manpreet?
Yeah, thank you, Shada. And as Namrata said, it's a very interesting question, and I'm glad she's answered it more technically and from the narrow perspective of space situational awareness. I want to zoom out on artificial intelligence in military applications, because in answer to a question like, is AI-enabled situational awareness contributory to stability or not, I think the answer is both yes and no, because there are some military applications of AI, which are a useful enabler, and ISR, which is situational awareness, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, decision support, simulation and modeling, collection and analysis of large amounts of data can be enablers, can contribute to stability. And particularly, when I see it from the Indian perspective against counterterrorism, most of this has been extremely helpful and will be in the future. So multi-domain situational awareness enabled by artificial intelligence can be a very good tool for stability. Even gathering real-time information during crisis of the battlefield, as well as logistics, again, great enablers through the artificial intelligence. But as Namrata pointed out, the possibility of data infidelity, because all of this is going to be based on algorithms created by humans, and if there's a bias or a wrong information that is fed in right in the beginning, then that situational awareness or what you're doing in terms of data mining becomes a very different proposition. So therefore, artificial intelligence can both be a tool for the good or a tool that goes bad. And I would say the positive and the negative ramifications are not yet absolutely crystal clear. I think we are discovering them as we go along. And as the systems become more and more intelligent, humans will have to show, I think, real intelligence, not just artificial intelligence, but real intelligence to make the best use of the artificial intelligence that we will be tapping more and more. So as I said, the question looks very simple, but the answer is going to be far more nuanced and not just a straight yes or no. It's going to be both.
Fantastic, thank you. I'll give Tong Zhao an opportunity to give an answer to this question as well. And then after that, I would like to turn to the High Representative, because I think this question really speaks to about the possibility of emerging technologies being able to contribute positively to addressing these risks. And I would like to get a sense from you of your assessments of the positive contributions that emerging technologies can offer. But before that, Tong.
Thank you. I think AI technology can contribute to situational awareness capabilities. But on the other hand, we also need to remember that one's enemies would always try to also use AI to deliberately deceive and mislead and spoof one's AI-enabled situational awareness. So AI will be used to counter AI as well, and that dynamic would be very complex. This action-reaction dynamics has now been thoroughly studied. It may turn out to be very like the dynamics between offensive, defensive weapon competition. There is no clear winner of either one. So it will be a constant competition, and that makes the situation even more complicated. I think I very much agree with Manpreet. We haven't seriously and thoroughly studied if AI-enabled situational awareness is not reliable. And also if there are complex ways in which AI and counteracting AI technologies interact. How will these create escalation pathways? So the risks have now been thoroughly studied. So the first step is actually for countries to jointly study and understand all the potential risks. And we also need to engage not only with small numbers or a small number of experts or diplomats from each country, but also need to comprehensively engage with all the major stakeholders, weapon developers, certifiers, users, military strategists, in order for the decision-making body within a country to fully appreciate the risks as a whole. So if the risks can be thoroughly appreciated, I think even if cooperative measures may be difficult to be undertaken initially, because AI is hard to be verifiable. But countries will still have strong incentive to take unilateral measures to address those risks, because they would understand that the risks could also be detrimental to their own interests.
Thank you. And I'll turn now to the High Representative to get your assessments on the positive contribution of emerging technologies.
Yes, I think there is a really good agreement on the panel. The answer is yes and no. I think there are probably some positives, but there are definitely, a lot of risks that we need to, first and foremost, really understand. The issue is that we don't really know at the moment. So, for example, what the issues that we talked about, the AI, it is definitely there is a risk for hacking, spoofing, and data poisoning, and all of those things that you have already mentioned, which will also introduce poison data to training data sets. So impacts will be the entire functioning of the system. So I think we need to better analyze and understand the risks, and some of those risks I don't think we can predict at the moment. But at the same time, I actually do agree that we definitely, because I deal with disarmament, I often talk about myself always discussing the dark side of issues. But we need to also better articulate how we will be able to use those emerging new technologies to our benefits, including in disarmament field. Potentially we could enhance our verification measures in nuclear disarmament. There are some discussions taking place how to, and in fact, it's already, the new technologies in general has definitely helped to make sure that we can actually monitor things much better, much more clearly. So we need to also put our heads together to better utilize what we are now getting as new and emerging technologies. I think the bottom line is technologies really have to be used by us, the humans. We cannot be used by those technologies. We need to decide how we want to use these. And then we need to do the thorough technological assessment, understand where the risks are, and then take measures to mitigate or minimize or prevent those risks. And that's how we need to structure our efforts.
Yeah, Shada, if I may, just quickly. So I think one way, since your question is about how can it positively benefit, right? So one way I can think of in the future, for example, we are still not at the level of super intelligence. Artificial intelligence today is not at the level that it can make fully autonomous decisions, right? But think of a scenario where it has been trained to recognize, for example, what is a nuclear detonation, or if there is an adversary satellite that is threatening. For example, it's focusing on a satellite in GEO or LEO, and then can tell you in terms of a decision maker, what is the activity, and can analyze it for you. That actually is a great additive act that the AI can do in the next 10 years to come. And what is happening, what I see in the US is that it is going to lead to that kind of scenario where it has super intelligence. So I can see positive benefits in terms of decision-making for policymakers as well, always, of course, adjudicated by a human, but even the capacity for humans to make better decisions might improve if I think of a more positive scenario.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to kind of offer some thoughts or contributions to the positive element of new technologies? Manpreet or Tom?
I think we've spoken about how humans have to decide how to use the technologies. I wanted to, Shata, if you'd allow me to speak a little bit about how do you mitigate the risks. And I want to underscore some of the points that the High Representative made, because she's made these very good suggestions at the end as to what you would do to mitigate the risks. And I want to sort of highlight 4 or 5 of them. One is, and I think this has been spoken by everyone on the panel, is promoting the shared understanding of risks. Tang Zhao spoke about how within China there is no understanding of risks, and definitely within the country, amongst the countries that have nuclear weapons, there is no shared understanding of risk. Something that we saw after the Cuban Missile Crisis between US and USSR, where both felt strategic stability was in their benefit, and therefore they moved towards arms control and building of the architecture of arms control. We don't see that shared understanding of risks of deterrence breakdown, what deterrence breakdown would look like, in densely populated regions. So that promotion of that sharedness of understanding, I think, is extremely important if we have to get out of the risks of inadvertent escalation. For this, we need to initiate dialogues on doctrine and capability buildup. She spoke about the P5 as a forum, as well as some of the other under the UN. I would think that even if we could have something like we had the nuclear security summit, if we could have a nuclear risk reduction summit or a nuclear reset summit, something of that nature, where all the stakeholder nations are brought together to talk about the doctrines, the capability build up, and how that is leading to increased risks of inadvertent escalation, particularly. Thirdly, statement on a futility of nuclear war in the presence of secure second strike capabilities. Like the statement that was made by Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev at one time to say nuclear war cannot be won and therefore should not be fought. We need to reiterate something like that to show that nuclear weapons are only capable of a certain kind of deterrence, and they are not, they don't have a multi-role capability, and therefore there is a futility about the role of nuclear weapons that needs to be sort of brought in more and more. We need to recall the basics of nuclear deterrence, that nuclear weapons are weapons of mass destruction, and you only need a small amount to be able to carry out that kind of mass destruction. I find, the growing popularity of the idea of limited nuclear war extremely disconcerting, because war fighting with nuclear weapons will never be limited. And therefore, talking about that or talking about proportionate deterrence, I think, is a retrograde step. And lastly, can we think about risk reduction measures such as formalizing low alert levels? Currently, for instance, between India, Pakistan, China, all the three countries maintain their nuclear arsenals in a demated state. Is there a possibility of formalizing these low alert levels? Is there a possibility of an agreement on non-targeting of nuclear command and control? So no cyber hacking, cyber disruptions of nuclear command and control. To start with, perhaps, as she pointed out, it could be political statements. Controls on technological deployment of certain kinds of technologies. And lastly, is another ABM of sorts possible? That ABM was essentially bipolar. But can we have something which includes more of the countries in order to get back to that sense that mutual vulnerability is what establishes nuclear deterrence? So these are just some thoughts on how we could be addressing some of the risks that are being generated by the emerging technologies. And I'd be happy to hear others on this.
Thank you for those excellent points. I agree. I mean, are there lessons from the 21st century, 20th century arms control regimes or forums that we can apply to mitigating risks and managing the deleterious effects of emerging technologies? Tong or High Representative, would you like to offer some thoughts? Tong? No.
Well, I'll be happy to add a couple of words. I think one important lesson from the Cold War era, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, is the heads of states from US and from USSR, they personally were aware of the risk of nuclear war and therefore made a personal effort to mitigate that risk. And in this regard, I really appreciate the participation of the High Representative here today, which demonstrates the really high level attention in the UN system to this issue. But I think when we come to individual countries, the greatest obstacle today is, despite the fact that some experts and maybe a small number of diplomats who start to recognize the risks, there are too many veto players in the internal bureaucracy. And in order to overcome those internal veto players, we need attention and a blessing from the highest political level. So I think even though risk reduction is viewed as a low-hanging fruit for international discussion, we need the support of highest level political leaders and to bring to their attention the importance of addressing the impact of emerging technologies and their impact on nuclear risks. I think that's very important for future international discussion if we want to see concrete results on these issues.
Thank you so much. I think that is a great place to bring this discussion to an end. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation between you all. I want to thank you all for your excellent contributions. I want to thank the Jeju Forum for hosting the session. Thanks to the APLN staff for their hard work in putting this panel together. And thanks above all, again, to our wonderful panelists, Manpreet Sethi, Namrata Goswami, Tong Zhao, and Izumi Nakamitsu. Thank you all very much. And that concludes the session.
Thank you.